I must say that you did it. You delivered.
After 2 weeks of hard-fought debate, nations struck a historic deal at COP28 in Dubai. The pact aims to transition the global economy away from fossil fuels. Here are some key takeaways. This is the first time the world has expressed a unified desire to eventually end the use of fossil fuels. The provision calls for, quote, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, with the goal of achieving net zero by 2050. While it is sending a resounding signal to international markets, it will not immediately destroy oil consumption or shrink prices. However, incremental policy moves and shifting investment trends over time could ensure a longer-term transformation of the energy economy. The pact also had rewards for oil producers. There's a clear acknowledgement that technologies like carbon capture can reduce the climate impact of oil, natural gas, and coal. Boosting such technologies was highlighted in a list of actions that countries should take to fight climate change. A source familiar with Saudi thinking said the kingdom could accept the deal because it provides a menu for every country to follow its own pathway. Carbon capture remains very expensive in certain applications. It's also never been proven at the vast global scale needed to have a significant impact. The pact is missing any additional financing to help developing nations transition away from fossil fuels. Money to help poor, climate-vulnerable countries adapt to the impacts of climate change was also lacking. However, there was a victory at the start of the summit for poor nations hit by climate disaster when delegates adopted a new fund to help them cope with loss and damages. The US, European Union, and scores of other countries said the deal maintained a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. But getting there will be tough. It would require cutting emissions nearly in half in just 6 years, and making it to net zero by 2050. The draft calls for countries to do so, but some, like the Alliance of Small Island States, questioned whether it will happen.
Hearing no objection, it is so decided.
COP28 climate summit nations on Wednesday agreed to a deal to, quote, transition away from fossil fuels, which scientists say is the last best hope to avert climate catastrophe. The historic deal was struck by nearly 200 countries gathered for the conference. It marks the first time in 3 decades of COP climate summits that nations have agreed on a concerted move away from oil, gas, and coal, which account for about 80% of global energy. The future role of fossil fuels has by far been the most contentious issue at the 2-week COP28 summit in Dubai. Negotiations had faced resistance from members of the OPEC oil producer group and its allies, especially Saudi Arabia, according to sources familiar with the discussions. And an earlier draft was criticized by scores of countries for failing to call for a, quote, phase-out of fossil fuels. The new draft came after overtime negotiations at the conference stretched late into the early hours of Wednesday morning. The deal calls for, quote, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. It also calls for a global tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030, speeding up efforts to reduce coal, and accelerating technologies such as carbon capture and storage that can clean up sectors difficult to decarbonize. Deals struck at UN climate summits must be passed by consensus, at which point individual countries are responsible for executing on the agreements.